Hello, Bookworm. The year is 2002. Mildred D. Taylor's book, The Land, wins the Coretta Scott King Award. Halle Berry becomes the first Black woman to win an Academy Award for Best Actress. And a book called The Bondwoman's Narrative is a New York Times bestseller. There's only one problem. No one knows the whereabouts of the author who wrote it. When I heard about the mystery behind this book, I was instantly fascinated. I started researching this manuscript and the woman who wrote it, and I soon found myself at the start of a curiosity voyage with several unexpected twists. My findings are too good not to share, so grab a hot beverage and get comfy because today we are going on a bookish deep dive. Every year in the month of February, Swan Galleries in New York City conducts an auction of printed and manuscript African Americana, in which they offer archival documents and artifacts that have surfaced after being lost or hidden for over a century. Prior to the auction, a catalog is mailed to interested parties, and in the 2001 catalog, an intriguing item came to the fore. It was listed in the catalog as an unpublished original manuscript titled The Bondwoman's Narrative by Hannah Crafts, a fugitive recently escaped from North Carolina. And it was described as a fictionalized biography about the early life and escape of a mixed-race enslaved woman. It was also noted that while it was uncertain whether the story had in fact been written by a Black person, it was believed to have been written by someone intimately familiar with the areas in the South where the story takes place, because the escape route used in the book is one that was historically used by runaways. Celebrated scholar and historian Henry Louis Gates Jr., who would later go on to write the introduction to the Bondwoman's Narrative, took an interest in the manuscript. It intrigued him that it had emerged from the private collection of Dorothy Porter Wesley, a famous Black librarian, bibliophile, and respected historian who said that she had reason to believe the manuscript was written by a Black person. If the author's claim that she was an escaped slave turned out to be true, then the Bondwoman's Narrative would be the first book written by an enslaved Black woman. Gates writes in the introduction that he was careful not to confuse this claim of being the first with Our Nig by Harriet E. Wilson, published in 1859, the first novel written by a Black woman who was born free. And it was definitely not to be confused with Autobiography of a Female Slave by Mattie Griffith, published in 1856, because the author claimed to be Black, but later revealed she was white when reviewers grew skeptical of her race based on her writing. The fact that Mattie Griffith gave herself away with her writing technique is a crucial element to this story, one that we'll get back to later. First, I want to add that Gates was amazed the Bondwoman's Narrative was a holograph, or handwritten manuscript. This was exciting because slave narratives and other media written by African Americans in the 19th century were often changed prior to publication by well-meaning editors or abolitionists who altered the text to serve their cause. But this appeared to be a manuscript in the original, unadulterated voice of an enslaved woman telling a story in the way that she wished for it to be told. Since the author claimed to be a fugitive slave, and since the route taken in the book by the protagonist, whose name is also Hannah, was a route traditionally used by runaways, it seemed possible the book was semi-autobiographical. Now, two questions arose from all of this excitement. One, was Hannah Crafts really an enslaved Black woman? And two, was she writing about herself in the Bondwoman's Narrative? Gates recognized that this manuscript was a monumental historical find, and he sent a friend to the auction to bid on his behalf. After the auction concluded, he received the good news that his was the winning bid. He was then keen to determine the racial identity of the author and planned to examine the manuscript for some key elements that would play a crucial role in making his determination. Remember when I said Mattie Griffith gave herself away with her writing style? Well, it turns out there are some distinct differences that commonly appear in 19th century literature written by white versus black authors. Allow me to briefly introduce 4 of them. The first was character portrayals. In the mid-19th century, white authors tended to write highly unflattering descriptions of black characters, whereas their descriptions of white characters were flattering, and their characters' white skin was rarely mentioned because it was treated as a default color. In contrast, black authors writing at the same time tended to craft nuanced character portrayals that drew sharp intellectual and class distinctions between enslaved people who, say, worked in the house versus those who worked in the fields. The second was whether racist assumptions about black people were present in the text, signaling a white writer. The third was whether the narrative aligned with established conventions of the slave narrative as a genre. And the fourth was whether the names of real people and places were used, since pro-slavery people historically went to such lengths attempting to invalidate slave narratives. It was common for black authors to use real names of people and places to give their work verisimilitude. Once Gates obtained the manuscript, he started reading, and so did I. I had no idea what to expect from this book. When I started reading, I figured the story could be good, but the most compelling thing about it would be its historical significance and the mystery behind the author. So imagine my surprise when I found myself suddenly swept up in an arresting work of sentimental fiction, replete with elements of Gothic literature, such as curses, hauntings, heartbreak, and tragedy. Another fascinating aspect of reading the book is that it includes all the text the author had written and crossed out in her manuscript, which lends an intimate feel to the experience because you get to see her creative process and the reorganization of her thoughts while she was writing. The story centers on Hannah, an enslaved woman of mixed race who works inside the master's house on a North Carolina plantation until her mistress becomes entangled with a shady businessman, forcing the mistress to flee from her home. Now, Hannah offers to join her mistress, and together they devise a plan to sneak away from the plantation unnoticed. But of course, things don't go as planned, and Hannah soon finds herself on a far more harrowing journey than she originally signed up for. Hannah establishes early on that she's aware of her African ancestry and how her blood shapes the world's view of her, as well as her value in society's estimation, saying, "No one ever spoke of my father or mother, but I soon learned what a curse was attached to my race, soon learned that the African blood in my veins would forever exclude me from the higher walks of life, that toil unremitted, unpaid toil must be my lot and portion, without even the hope or expectation of anything better." While she acknowledges that this fact is difficult to swallow, she admits that it's even harder to accept because of her light complexion. Because she's mixed race, Hannah is, at times, able to use her light skin to her advantage, making this a slave narrative in which the protagonist often passes for white on her quest for freedom. However, there are plenty of times when Hannah chooses not to deny her ancestry at crucial moments, thereby exemplifying her strength and conviction. Hannah also explains that as a child she had an insatiable hunger for learning. Unfortunately, it was illegal in most antebellum Southern states to teach a slave to read or write because it would encourage free thinking. Slave owners ensured the people they enslaved were uneducated, so they remained subservient and less likely to revolt. Let's really stop and think about that for a moment. Strategically denying people access to education to prohibit free thinking. If someone is standing in the way of you being educated, ask why. Back to the book. Hannah tells of how she learned to read and write in secret and was therefore able to eventually write her story. And what a story it is! Not only do we journey alongside Hannah on her perilous quest, where every decision she makes is motivated by a longing for freedom and a desire to preserve her virtue, but we also get to know the myriad characters she meets along the way. We're made privy to their stories of haunted trees, cursed families, cruel slave masters, and more. And all the while, a force of evil is hot on Hannah's trail. When I finished reading the book, it was time to consider the key elements Gates intended to look at to determine the author's race. First up, character. Did the author write varied descriptions, both flattering and unflattering, of black and white characters? Yes. And did she draw nuanced distinctions between black characters working in different roles? Also yes. In fact, the protagonist is ungenerous in her descriptions of the enslaved people working in the fields because, as someone who works in the house, she considers herself superior. Second, racism. Were racist assumptions about black people present in the text? No. Third, genre. Did the narrative align with established conventions of the slave narrative as a genre? According to Gates, who specializes in slave narratives, yes. For example, the book opens with a traditional apologia, in which the author explains that she hopes to convey how slavery blights the happiness of both white and black people. She refers to slavery as the, quote, institution whose curse rests over the fairest land the sun shines upon. She also expresses self-doubt and wonders if a literary venture from someone of such humble means could be well received, let alone successful in making its point. And finally, names. Did the author use the names of real people and places? No, and yes. This is where things get even more interesting because unlike typical slave narratives where real names are traditionally used, the bondwoman's narrative is a mix of fake and real names. This was exciting because all signs pointed to the author being a black woman, and if it turned out that she was writing about herself in a fictionalized autobiography, then the names of real people mentioned in the book could be used as a starting point in searching for her. But before Gates could do that, he first needed to determine the date when the manuscript was written. He consulted 3 specialists on this subject who all confirmed that the manuscript was written sometime between 1850 and 1870. He also consulted a specialist who confirmed that the paper the manuscript was written on was also from that window of time. And then, when he was having the ink tested, Gates encountered another big breakthrough. It turns out the manuscript was written with something called iron gall ink. A fun fact, there's another significant document that was written with iron gall ink. Perhaps you've heard of it, the Declaration of Independence. Now, iron gall ink was widely used until 1860. That information, coupled with a mention in the book of an equestrian statue of Andrew Jackson in Washington, D.C., a real statue that was dedicated in January of 1853, placed the manuscript as being written sometime between 1853 and 1861. An investigator and historical document examiner by the name of Joe Nickel examined the manuscript and provided a lengthy report of his observations, a copy of which can be found at the back of the bondwoman's narrative. Now, based on when the manuscript was written, Dr. Nickel summarized that the author's serviceable, unrefined handwriting, her idiosyncratic use of punctuation, and her abundance of spelling errors all but confirmed that the author was, quote, a self-educated former slave. At this point, Gates had every reason to believe that the author was in fact a formerly enslaved black woman, so now he could start searching for her. Gates began by searching for a woman named Hannah Crafts, but there were none listed in the entire U.S. federal census between 1860 and 1880. He then began searching for variant spellings of the name. He pored over census indexes and records, following one exciting lead to another, which inevitably led to one dead end after another, until finally he had a breakthrough. It seemed that the Mr. Wheeler character in the book was based on the real-life John Hill Wheeler of North Carolina, who was one of the most famous slaveholders in America during that time when he was locked in a legal battle with his escaped former slave, Jane Johnson. As it happens, an escaped slave named Jane is mentioned in the bondwoman's narrative. In fact, her escape leads the Wheelers to purchase Hannah as her replacement. Now, Gates compared this to the information in John Hill Wheeler's diary and concluded that not only had the author been enslaved by the Wheeler family, but she also fled from the family and escaped north sometime in 1857. Even with this new information, Gates was unable to find a former enslaved woman named Hannah Crafts. As a last resort, he took a research assistant's advice and searched for a woman named Hannah Vincent, because for a brief time, the protagonist in the book is enslaved by a family called the Vincents, and it was common practice to impose upon enslaved people the surname of the family that owned them. So Gates searched for Hannah Vincent, and he found one living in Burlington, New Jersey, the same state the protagonist in the book is fleeing to. Unfortunately, the Hannah Vincent in New Jersey acquired her name through marriage, and the search for Hannah Crafts reached its final dead end. When Gates wrote the introduction to the Bondwoman's narrative in 2001, he concluded that the identity of the mixed-race fugitive author who called herself Hannah Crafts would, quote, remain one of the most exciting mysteries of African American literature. If you're sad that the story ends there, then I have good news for you. In October of 2023, Greg Hechimovich published The Life and Times of Hannah Crafts, the true story of the Bondwoman's narrative. This book chronicles the monumental task of bringing to light the author's true identity. Should I tell you what it is now? I don't think I should. Should I? It's so good. When you find out what it is, it's just, I can't. I can't tell you yet. This man spent over 20 years researching and writing this book, and it's so good. It's such a good reveal. We'll get to it, I promise. But first, we need to set the scene. The year is 2002, and thanks to Henry Louis Gates Jr., the Bondwoman's narrative has been published for the very first time, over 100 years after it was first written. Incredible. And it becomes a New York Times bestseller with nearly 200,000 copies sold. One of the people who reads the book is Greg Hechimovich, and he takes an immediate interest in the mystery behind the author's identity. He embarks on a decades-long journey, searching obscure archives, scanning property records, poring over federal census data, reading diaries and old almanacs, until at last he finds her. And thanks to his exhaustive research, we now have a timeline of the author's life, and I'm going to share that with you right now. 1779. Hannah's grandmother is just 2 years old when she and her family are abducted from Jamaica and brought to the United States, where they are sold into slavery. 1794. Hannah's mother, Hannah Sr., is born on Thomas Pugh Sr.'s property in North Carolina. 1811. Hannah Sr. is bestowed as part of her mistress's dowry on the occasion of her marriage to Louis Bond. 1826. Hannah is born enslaved to the Bond family. We need to stop for a moment and think about what this means. Remember what I said earlier about enslaved people and surnames? And it was common practice to impose upon enslaved people the surname of the family that owned them. This means that when Hannah Crafts was born, she would have been called Hannah Bond. When she titled her book The Bondwoman's Narrative, she wasn't just talking about a bondwoman or a female slave. She was hiding in plain sight. She used a clever pun embedded in her book's title to reveal her identity. This is one of my favorite revelations about this incredible woman. Like, can we give it up for Hannah Crafts? Well played, ma'am. Her name would go on to change not once, but twice more in her lifetime. Let's get back to the timeline, and I'll tell you when and why. 1836. Hannah is 10 years old when her mother is moved to a different Bond family house located in Tennessee. Sometime in the 1840s, Hannah is moved to the household of Thomas Bond Jr. Estate records show that he had an extensive library, and it's presumed Hannah learned to read and write, possibly in secret, during this time. 1851, Bond family records indicate that Hannah had a child, and it's believed this offspring was the byproduct of forced union with Thomas Bond Jr. 1852, there is no longer record of Hannah's child. The most likely scenario is that the child died of illness, possibly from typhoid fever. Also in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, is a national sensation, which suggests there's a demand for books that cast a critical eye at slavery. 1856, Hannah is acquired by the Wheeler family, and she starts writing. In May of 1857, Hannah fled from the Wheelers and headed north. At this point in Greg Hechimovich's research, something truly serendipitous happens. He gets a call from a friend who just happened to be discussing Hechimovich's search for Hannah Crafts, former slave to the Wheeler family, with a person named Lee Miller. Now, the names Craft and Wheeler struck a chord with Lee Miller because she had recently purchased an old farmhouse located in central New York known as Craft Farm. And in the attic of that house, she discovered some old papers which included a letter warning of a Mr. Wheeler seeking an escaped slave in the region. It turns out that when Hannah fled north, she took refuge at Craft Farm in central New York, owned at the time by Horace and Harriet Crafts. This is when Hannah casts off the surname of her enslaver and forges a new identity for herself. In honor of the people who sheltered her, she takes on the last name Crafts. There's one more surname to discover, so let's get back to the timeline. Census records from 1857 indicate that Hannah was living in Timbuktu, New Jersey. 1860, she lived briefly in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, before moving to live permanently in Burlington, New Jersey. Sometime in the 1860s, she married a pastor named Thomas Vincent, who later passed away in 1883. 1905 to 1910, there is no death certificate on record for Hannah Vincent, but federal census records suggest her death occurred sometime between 1905 and 1910 after she had lived a very long life. Who would have thought that the Hannah Vincent living in Burlington, New Jersey, who Gates found by searching for a slave owner's surname, would turn out to be the very same Hannah Vincent living in Burlington, New Jersey, who Hechimovich found at the end of his long search. When Gates wrote the introduction to the Bondwoman's narrative in 2001, he had found her. He just didn't know it. I could only scratch the surface in this video of what Hannah Crafts experienced in her lifetime. So if you want to learn more about this remarkable woman, check out this book. Be advised, though, that it does not follow Hannah's life in a linear fashion, and it's not focused solely on her. It offers an in-depth look at the people she encountered in her lifetime, people who enslaved her, people who were enslaved alongside her, and people who helped her on her journey to freedom. It also examines why she chose to write her story as a fictionalized narrative. And one of my favorite things to read about in this book is the other works of literature that informed her writing. One of them was Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I'll post a sample comparative excerpt that's featured in the back of the Bondwoman's narrative. You can pause the video if you'd like to read it. The similarities are so great that it's believed Hannah carried a copy of Bleak House with her when she fled to freedom. And of course, I encourage you to read the Bondwoman's narrative. It's a fantastic story and an absolute wonder that it exists for our enjoyment in print. We now know this is the first book written by an enslaved Black woman. It's also the first story of a fugitive escaping, and the first book with a subplot of passing for white written in the African American literary tradition. That's a lot of firsts. This book is an incredible piece of history. It happens to be highly compelling, and you have the added advantage of knowing just how impressive and resilient the author was, and you will carry that knowledge with you when you read her words. I have posted affiliate links for both books in the description box. I have also included a link to the Yale Library Collections where you can scan a full copy of the handwritten manuscript. With thanks to Henry Louis Gates Jr. for his insightful introduction to the Bondwoman's narrative, Hannah Crafts for gifting us with her superb story, and Greg Hechimovich for dedicating 20 years to researching and writing a biography of Hannah Crafts. Without them, this video would not have been possible. It took considerable time and energy to make this video, so if you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe if you'd like to join our community, and your code word for the comments for watching to the end of the video will be Liberty. My name is Hannah Greendale. Thank you so much for joining me today. Until the next one, I wish you happy reading.